What if the darkest tradition of the Blood Empress was never written in any chronicle because everyone who witnessed it simply disappeared? The question alone unsettles the mind, because history is full of rituals, but very few were designed not to be practiced, only to be feared. Scholars whisper that inside her inner court, deep behind walls painted with crushed cinnabar and iron dust, a secret ceremony governed how she kept power without lifting a blade. And the strangest part is that the ritual was not performed often, yet its mere possibility was enough to bend generals, nobles, and foreign envoys into obedience. No one knew when it would happen or who would be chosen. They only knew that once the Empress ordered the doors sealed, truth, loyalty, and identity themselves were tested in ways no outsider ever truly understood. Some preserved fragments describe a narrow chamber illuminated only by bowls of oil that burned with a reddish flame. Witnesses were stripped of their titles the moment they entered. Rank dissolved. Bloodlines meant nothing. Every person stood equal before the Empress, and this erasure alone terrified them more than any punishment. Power in her court depended on visibility, on being known, on having a documented lineage. Losing that, even briefly, created a psychological fracture that few rulers in history ever exploited with such precision. And the Empress knew the human mind breaks faster when its certainties are removed one by one. The ritual supposedly began with a single question spoken in complete darkness. No one agrees on the wording, but all surviving references hint that it forced the participant to confront something they had buried for years. Secrets that shaped their ambition, regrets that carved their loyalties, desires they feared would be exposed. The Empress didn't need torture devices. She used their own memories as weapons. Most rulers tested strength. She tested vulnerability, watching who trembled, who stayed silent, who tried to lie when lying no longer mattered. Those who failed the unspoken test vanished from the court records, erased so cleanly that later historians doubted they ever existed. Those who survived returned changed, speaking less boldly, moving more cautiously, glancing at shadows as if the ritual were still happening. The most unsettling detail in the archives is that the Empress never participated directly. She stood behind a veil woven with thin streaks of hardened pigment, observing every reaction without being seen. Power without exposure was her greatest advantage. Imagine how disorienting it must have felt to reveal your darkest truth while not knowing whether she was inches from you or far across the room. A ruler who mastered fear didn't need executions to maintain control. She only needed doubt. And this ritual, unnamed and unrecorded, became the silent backbone of her reign, shaping alliances, dissolving betrayals, and reminding every court member that their mind, not their sword, was the battlefield she controlled. And maybe that's why this tradition remains so obscure. Not because it was rare, but because the people who endured it understood that speaking of it made them vulnerable again. But tell me something. Have you ever felt the weight of a truth you were afraid to face? The kind that reshapes everything once spoken aloud? If this opens a door inside you, share your thoughts in the comments. Leave a like to help more people understand the depth of this story, and check if you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next, because the next layer of this court is far more disturbing than the ritual itself, and it pulls us deeper into a world where power was measured not in armies, but in the secrets people feared to reveal. Inside the Blood Empress palace, the ritual you just witnessed was only the threshold. Beyond it existed a system of silent ceremonies so subtle, so meticulously engineered, that many outsiders mistook them for coincidences rather than mechanisms of control. These inner chambers, hidden behind layered corridors and guarded by attendants who never spoke above a whisper, functioned like the nervous system of her rule. Everything pulsed outward from here. Alliances, betrayals, ascendancies, disappearances. If the forbidden ritual shattered certainty, the inner ceremonies rebuilt it, but always in her image, never in the shape of the person who entered. Those brought into these chambers never came alone. They arrived escorted by figures known as the veiled stewards, women trained from childhood to read posture, breathing patterns, and micro-expressions with unnerving precision. Before any ceremony began, a steward would observe the chosen court member in silence for several minutes, committing to memory every twitch, every hesitation, every flinch that might reveal what pressure points could later be used to shape loyalty. It was said they could detect a deceiver the same way a trained tracker spots disturbed soil without needing evidence, only instinct refined through ritual conditioning. The chambers themselves were masterpieces of psychological architecture. The Empress understood that fear was effective, but environment could be even more powerful. The walls were coated in mineral paint that absorbed sound, making every footstep feel heavier, every breath amplified inside the mind. Light came from a narrow shaft above, so any movement cast long, distorted shadows that made even the strongest nobles feel like smaller versions of themselves. Those who entered expecting interrogation often found something far more destabilizing: kindness delivered with surgical precision. A steward would offer water, speak a single gentle sentence, or reveal a fragment of personal history that mirrored the fear of the guest. This was not compassion, it was calibration. Once a person felt seen, their guard weakened, and once it weakened, the Empress's influence slipped in without resistance. Documentation suggests that the Empress rarely issued orders in these rituals. Instead, she guided people toward choices they believed they had made freely. A general once emerged from the chamber convinced that the decision to withdraw troops had been his own strategic insight, not a suggestion slipped into conversation by a steward trained to plant ideas as softly as falling ash. A foreign envoy reported feeling an overwhelming urge to confess state secrets, not because he was threatened, but because the Empress's silence made withholding truth feel unnatural. These ceremonies weaponized intimacy, creating a bond that had no name but left an unmistakable imprint on the mind: devotion without reason. What made the system truly unbreakable was the absence of spectacle. No proclamations, no decrees, no punishments displayed to the public. The Empress did not need fear built on blood. She cultivated fear built on unpredictability, on the knowledge that loyalty could be reinforced or dismantled with a whisper behind a closed door. Some courtiers described leaving the chamber with a sensation that part of their own story had been rewritten, as though memory itself had shifted to align with the Empress's expectations. Whether this was psychological suggestion or deliberate manipulation remains debated, but the result was the same. Once a person walked out, their allegiance was sealed with a quiet kind of permanence that no rebellion could crack. This is the part historians struggle to categorize because it blurs the boundary between ritual and strategy. Yet to understand the Blood Empress, you must grasp that she considered both indistinguishable, and as these chambers shaped her court, one mind at a time, another force began rising among the palace women, individuals whose influence would soon rival that of generals and nobles alike, drawing us deeper into the anatomy of her power. As the Empress expanded her system of silent control, an unexpected class of power began to form around her. They were not generals, not ministers, not nobles with ancestral privileges. They were women whose origins were often obscure, sometimes forgotten even by themselves, yet their presence shaped the court more profoundly than any official decree. Historians call them the shadow circle, though no document uses that term directly. It emerges through fragments, through testimonies whispered across borders, through accounts of emissaries who sensed eyes on them even in empty rooms. These women operated in roles that defied the neat categories of traditional courts. A single figure might act as counselor during the day, spy by twilight, executioner when needed, and quiet priestess during rituals that blurred the line between judgment and confession. Their defining trait was not cruelty, though cruelty was among their tools. It was clarity. They understood that the Blood Empress maintained power not by force of armies, but by controlling perception, by shaping narratives, by deciding which truths were allowed to exist inside the palace walls. Some of them came from conquered territories, chosen for their resilience, their refusal to break under interrogation. Others were lifted from anonymity after displaying unusual insight during minor disputes or ceremonies. A few were raised from childhood within the palace itself, groomed for roles that required absolute emotional precision. What united them was a training regimen as soft as it was brutal. They were taught never to react first. Their silence forced others to reveal themselves. Their expressions neutral enough to make liars tremble and honest people doubt their own memories. When foreign envoys visited the court, they expected to negotiate with the Empress or her ministers. Instead, they found themselves subtly studied by one of these women who might offer a single question that revealed what the envoy hoped to hide. There are accounts of diplomats fleeing the palace mid-negotiation, shaken by the sensation that the shadow circle already knew the outcome of the discussion before it began. Their influence ran so deep that decisions often seemed to take shape in the Empress' mind before she ever spoke of them, guided by intelligence gathered through channels invisible to even her closest military commanders. But the most feared among them were the ones trained for what the archives vaguely call night justice. Their task was not to punish betrayal. The Empress seldom used punishment as a primary tool. Instead, they erased the symptoms of disloyalty before they could spread. A noble who grew too ambitious might find his most trusted servant confessing something she should not know, revealing that the palace listened in places he believed safe. A general plotting a quiet consolidation of power might wake with the feeling that someone had stood at the foot of his bed, not harming him, only watching, leaving his mind uncertain whether it was dream or warning. The Empress did not need executions when psychological fractures worked faster. Yet these women were not merely instruments. Some sources imply they practiced their own private rites, gatherings that took place in the upper towers where wind muffled their voices. There they exchanged the emotional weight they carried from the tasks performed in the Empress' name, a ritual of release that ensured none of them became unstable under the burden of their work. Ironically, it was this shared vulnerability that made them so powerful. They moved as a single organism, loyal not just to the Empress, but to one another, forming a network stronger than any military chain of command. Their rise marked a transformation in the court. Influence no longer belonged to those who shouted the loudest or spent the most gold. It belonged to those who observed, remembered, and acted with precision. And as their presence grew, so did the rituals that bound the Empress's followers into an unbreakable psychological grip, setting the stage for the next tradition, one far more brutal in purpose and far more concealed in execution. The rise of the Shadow Circle reshaped the Empress's authority, but loyalty itself still needed to be measured, harvested, and renewed. Inside the palace, this process took the form of a tradition known only through fragmented accounts, the harvest of oaths. Unlike the forbidden ritual of truth or the silent ceremonies of the inner chambers, this practice, unfolded in full view of the court, yet revealed almost nothing about its true purpose. It was both spectacle and warning, wrapped in symbols too old to decode and too precise to be coincidence. The event took place at irregular intervals, adding a layer of tension that settled over the palace like an unspoken storm. No one knew when the Empress would call for the harvest, and the unpredictability was deliberate. Preparation prevented fear from working at its fullest capacity. Surprise ensured. The mind remained vulnerable. When the moment arrived, the Empress would appear in the Hall of 9 Mirrors, a chamber designed not for reflection, but for distortion. The mirrors, polished with powdered hematite, stretched and narrowed the bodies of those who stood before them, making even the proudest nobles appear fragile, unfinished, or somehow dishonest in their own skin. Participants were summoned in small groups, a detail that denied them the comfort of numbers. Each person entered, carrying a small token representing their allegiance, often a carved emblem or strip of painted silk. The Empress never touched these offerings. Instead, she nodded toward the shadow circle, who collected the tokens with gestures so smooth they seemed rehearsed to the heartbeat. What followed next was the true mechanism of control, though to an outsider it looked like little more than ritual theater. A steward would step forward and recite a detail from the past of a participant, something so specific, so intimate, that it left the entire room suspended between dread and fascination. Sometimes it was a childhood event the person had not spoken of in decades. Sometimes it was a decision made in private chambers. Sometimes it was an emotion they never intended to reveal. The point was not humiliation, but exposure. The Empress needed every court member to understand that she possessed a kind of sight that no resistance could outrun. Even if the details were gathered through espionage, suggestion, or psychological observation, the effect was the same. The participant felt seen in a way that erased defiance at its roots. Once the revelation settled, the individual was asked a single question about their future allegiance, spoken in a tone so calm it forced honesty through fear alone. A wrong answer did not bring punishment, because the ritual relied on maintaining the illusion of free will. But those who hesitated learned that the shadow circle remembered hesitation as faithfully as betrayal. Days later, alliances would shift, privileges would disappear, and invitations to key gatherings would never arrive. Exile in the Blood Empress court did not begin with the loss of land or titles. It began with silence, with doors that no longer opened, with whispers that ceased when one approached. What made the harvest so effective was its dual nature. It was public enough to broadcast the Empress's reach, yet private enough that no one could fully understand its rules. Every participant left believing the ritual was tailored to them, that the Empress had extracted a precise truth they thought buried. The Hall of Nine Mirrors transformed personal vulnerability into political obedience, reinforcing the idea that loyalty was not a choice, but a necessity for survival. And as these ceremonies took deeper hold, other, more intricate rites emerged, shaping new members of the court long before they realized they were being shaped at all. If this unfolding of hidden loyalties and exposed truths stirs something in you, share your thoughts in the comments, because reactions to stories like this reveal how power still operates in ways we rarely notice, and your perspective adds another layer to the journey we are tracing through the Empress's shadowed world. If the harvest of oaths displayed loyalty in public, the Pact of Three Knights reshaped it in private. This tradition was reserved for newcomers whose potential either intrigued or unsettled the Blood Empress. It was a method not to test their allegiance but to rewrite it, weaving them into the palace fabric so completely that the idea of disobedience would feel unnatural, almost physically painful. Historians have argued whether the pact was psychological conditioning or ritual theater. Surviving descriptions suggest it was both, executed with a precision that blurred the boundary between manipulation and transformation. The first night was known as the Night of Stripping, though nothing physical was removed. Instead, the individual was led into a chamber where light was controlled so carefully that shadows behaved like independent beings. A woman from the shadow circle would walk around the newcomer in silence, making note of posture, breathing, and hesitation. Then she would speak a single sentence describing the newcomer's deepest fear, not as a question, but as a fact. How they reacted determined how the next hours unfolded. Some froze. Some protested. Some broke down. But the ritual never punished emotion. It cataloged it, building a map of vulnerabilities that would be used with surgical precision. The second night belonged to the Empress, though she remained unseen. The newcomer was placed in a high corridor open to the wind, where they were told to recount their greatest ambition aloud. Many hesitated, thinking it a trap. Yet ambition was not condemned in this court. It was raw material. Hidden behind veils, the Empress and her closest attendants listened not to the words themselves, but to the pauses between them. They measured hunger, fear, desperation, longing. The Empress favored those whose ambition carried a wound, because such people were easier to bind through purpose. Those who spoke confidently without fracture were considered volatile. Their path in the court tended to be shorter, their influence less trusted. The third night was the breaking point. The newcomer was guided into the Chamber of Echoes, a room constructed to distort sound so effectively that even a whisper returned layered with new tones. Here, they were asked to declare who they believed they would become under the Empress's rule. Whatever answer they gave, the room would repeat it back to them in fragmented echoes. Some heard encouragement, others heard doubt embedded in their own voice. Some heard what sounded like the Empress speaking through the distortion, though this was likely the mind projecting authority into the void. The purpose of the chamber was to create uncertainty, then push the person to cling to the version of themselves that aligned most closely with the Empress' expectations. By dawn, the Pact of 3 Nights was complete. The individual emerged not humiliated, not tortured, but rearranged. Their memories had been stirred, their ambitions exposed, their fears mapped, their sense of self tilted just enough that the Empress became an anchor rather than a ruler. Those who passed the pact walked differently afterward, their movements smoother, their speech more measured, as if they carried invisible threads, connecting them to the throne. They often spoke of feeling chosen, though the Empress never used such language. She simply understood that someone who believes they have been seen entirely no longer questions where their loyalty should reside. But the pact also created fractures among those who observed its effects. Some feared the newcomer's newfound clarity, wondering what private truths had been exchanged during those nights. Others sensed that the Empress was refining her ability to shape entire generations of the court, creating a hierarchy defined not by lineage, but by psychological depth. And while these initiations were transforming individuals, something even more enigmatic was taking form within the palace walls, etched not through ceremony, but through symbols that carried meanings lost to time. As the Pact of 3 Nights shaped the minds of new court members, another layer of the Empress world emerged in the silent spaces between rituals. This layer did not rely on spoken commands or psychological manipulation. Instead, it lived in stone, pigment, fabric, and light. It pulsed through a chamber known as the Hall of Shadows, a place not listed in official architectural plans, yet mentioned often enough in clandestine letters that its existence is nearly certain. Scholars believe the Empress used this hall to encode her legacy, not in documents that could be destroyed or rewritten, but in symbols so meticulously crafted that only those shaped by her rituals could interpret them. The Hall of Shadows was said to contain no windows, no torches, no obvious source of illumination. Light entered indirectly through narrow slits carved into the upper walls, creating beams that shifted throughout the day, revealing patterns only visible at specific angles. The Empress designed the chamber to reward patience, observation, and intuition. Those who rushed saw nothing. Those who feared darkness saw only their own silhouette stretched across the floor. But those who slowed their breath and watched the interplay of dim light and rough stone began to discern shapes that did not appear carved, yet could not be coincidence. Some symbols resembled serpents swallowing their own tails, but their bodies were segmented in ways that suggested stages of transformation. Others looked like eyes drawn without pupils, implying perception without judgment. There were clusters of lines that mirrored constellations long forgotten, though mapped onto the walls with distortions that scholars still debate. And then there were the shadows themselves, forms that appeared when the slits aligned with the sun's position, creating silhouettes that shifted from animal to human to something unclassifiable as the hours passed. These shifting shapes were not random. They were messages, or perhaps warnings, teaching court members to read nuance, instability, and the fluid nature of power. The Shadow Circle trained initiates to observe the hall not as an artwork, but as a living instrument. A steward might bring a new member into the chamber and instruct them to describe what they saw. No answer was entirely correct, yet none were entirely wrong. The point was not to decipher a single meaning, but to evaluate how the person perceived tension, ambiguity, and hidden order. The Empress believed that those who could navigate uncertainty without panic were more valuable than those who clung to fixed interpretations. Power, after all, was not stable. It shifted, fractured, reassembled. The hall became a metaphor for the palace itself, but the hall served another purpose as well. It was a repository of memory, an archive that transcended written language. Some symbols referenced ancient rites practiced by previous dynasties, suggesting the Empress inherited secrets that predated her reign by centuries. Others hinted at strategies for managing rebellions or manipulating negotiations, encoded through patterns that only the initiated could read. A few shapes appeared unfinished, as if awaiting future generations to complete them, implying the Empress did not view her rule as an endpoint, but as a link in a chain of governance defined by perception, not force. There are accounts describing how the Empress would visit the hall alone, sometimes at dawn, sometimes long after midnight. No attendants followed, no guards entered. Those who glimpsed her, leaving, reported an expression of unsettling calm, as if the chamber had reminded her that even absolute power depended on forces beyond human control. Perhaps she saw herself reflected in the shifting symbols, a ruler defined not by bloodshed alone, but by the ability to shape narratives, manipulate fear, and engineer loyalty through rituals as subtle as breath. What remains certain is that the Hall of Shadows amplified everything the Empress built within her court. It trained followers to see beyond appearances, to anticipate shifts, to understand that meaning itself could be weaponized. And while these symbols quietly shaped the future of her dynasty, another practice, far more brutal and far more direct, began to emerge from the heart of the palace, governed not by nuance but by uncompromising terror. While the Hall of Shadows taught perception and nuance, the Blood Empress preserved another tradition designed for the opposite effect: clarity through fear. This ritual was not used often, but its existence alone shaped behavior across the palace. It was referred to in coded fragments as the Rite of Red Silence, a name that suggested brutality. Yet the true horror lay not in the act itself, but in the psychological landscape surrounding it. The Empress never announced when the rite would be performed. The court simply sensed it, like an atmospheric pressure change that made conversations thin and breaths shallow. The process did not begin with an accusation. It began with absence. A court member who had grown bold or careless would fail to appear at a meeting, or their usual attendants would suddenly act as if they had never existed. Days might pass before anyone dared ask questions, and by then the Empress's message had already taken root. Power was not taken from a traitor. It was withdrawn from them, as if their presence had been a courtesy the Empress no longer extended. Only after this slow erasure did the palace doors open for the ritual itself. The location was always the same: a stone courtyard deep within the inner fortress, a space too small for an audience yet too exposed for privacy. The architecture forced those present to confront the event without the comfort of shadows or distance. There were no elaborate instruments, no roaring crowds, no public spectacle. Instead, the ritual unfolded with a precision that was almost reverent. Members of the Shadow Circle escorted the accused to the center of the courtyard, their movements synchronized, their silence absolute. They formed a ring around the traitor, not to restrain, but to contain the emotional weight of the moment. The Empress entered last. She never touched the accused, never raised her voice, never needed to. Her presence alone altered the air, pressing down with a gravity that made even seasoned generals falter. She would recite a single statement, not about the betrayal itself, but about the moment she first sensed the individual's fracture of loyalty. This detail was always something small, almost trivial. A hesitation during a private conversation or an unfinished gesture at a ceremonial gathering. The message was unmistakable. She saw disloyalty before it fully formed, long before the person believed they had acted upon it. Punishment came not through physical suffering, but through ritual purity. A bowl of crimson pigment was poured over the courtyard stones, its slow spread symbolizing the stain of broken allegiance. The traitor was given a chance to speak, though most could barely force words through the weight of the moment. Those who confessed were granted a strange mercy. Their name was recorded among the forgotten, ensuring their lineage would never be hunted. Those who refused acceptance were left to the silence, their memory erased from archives, ceremonies, and future mentions. Erasure, in this court, was a deeper wound than death. What made the rite of red silence so devastating was that it required no violence. The mind of the traitor broke long before the ritual concluded. Witnesses often reported an unsettling shift in the atmosphere afterward, as if the courtyard itself absorbed the emotional residue of the event. Even the shadow circle, trained to withstand psychological weight, left the space with controlled breaths and tightened posture. And for the rest of the court, the lesson was unmistakable. Betrayal did not need to be proven. It only needed to be perceived by the Empress. Yet the most haunting part of this tradition is what followed. After each rite, new symbols allegedly appeared in the Hall of Shadows, as though the Empress used the ritual not only to punish, but to encode further warnings into the palace itself. These additions deepened the mystery of her rule, suggesting that every act of discipline became part of a larger, invisible narrative guiding future generations. If this glimpse into her silent, merciless justice stirred something in you, share your perspective in the comments, because the way we react to these forgotten rituals says as much about power today as it does about the Empress's world. After each enactment of the Rite of Red Silence, the palace seemed to enter a suspended state, as if fear had settled into the stones themselves. Yet the Blood Empress understood something that few rulers of her age ever mastered. Fear alone could not bind a dynasty. Loyalty rooted in terror decays quickly. People forced to bow eventually learn how to rise. What she needed was a different anchor, one that wove belonging and awe into the very fabric of her rule. And so emerged the forbidden festivities, celebrations so obscure and tightly controlled that most citizens of the empire never heard even whispers of them. These events occurred only once or twice a year, timed not by seasons or political milestones, but by the Empress's perception of the court's emotional state. If tension grew too sharp, she softened it. If complacency crept in, she steered it back toward reverence. The festivities took place in a secluded garden surrounded by high onyx walls, a space purposely designed to distort sound so that laughter, music, and chanting never reached the outer palace. Only select members of the court were invited, yet attendance was not a privilege. It was a test, and every gesture within these celebrations held meaning. The garden itself was transformed for the event. Hundreds of lanterns carved from thin stone emitted a dim bluish glow that made shadows ripple like water. Musicians performed behind screens, their faces concealed to prevent participants from identifying them later. Servants wearing embroidered masks moved silently between guests, offering dishes whose recipes have never been recovered. Some scholars speculate that the ingredients symbolized renewal, binding, or shared secrecy. Others argue that the strangeness of the flavors altered the mind just enough to heighten emotional responses. But the true core of these festivities lay in a sequence of symbolic acts orchestrated by the shadow circle. A court member might be asked to light a lantern for someone they admired, or place a stone on an altar representing a burden they carried. Someone else might be guided to walk a narrow path illuminated only by flickering light, while others watched in silence. These acts were not rituals in a mystical sense. They were psychological exercises, revealing loyalties, insecurities, ambitions, and hidden grievances without a single word spoken. The Empress observed from a raised platform, her expression unreadable, absorbing every unguarded moment. What unsettled participants most was that the festivities were not celebratory in the traditional sense. Joy and unease flowed together, creating a dissonance that left the mind vulnerable. People laughed more freely than usual, but the laughter lingered just a moment too long. They embraced one another, but their eyes darted toward the Empress to gauge whether the gesture aligned with her expectations. By weaving warmth into the same tapestry as dread, the Empress created a psychological landscape where neither emotion could exist without the other. It was a form of conditioning disguised as revelry. These celebrations also reinforced the Empress' mastery of contradiction. Just days after witnessing the erasure of a traitor, the court now experienced the illusion of intimacy. They felt chosen, included, connected. But beneath the surface, every action was being catalogued, every glance measured, every hesitation stored for future decisions. The forbidden festivities were not escapes from the intensity of her reign. They were calibrations, recalibrating the court's emotional equilibrium in ways no decree or punishment could. Over time, invitations to these events became markers of status. Those who attended frequently were presumed to be in the Empress's favor, though such assumptions often proved dangerous. Some who felt newly empowered made bold moves. In the following weeks, unaware that the festivities had revealed fractures the Empress would later exploit. Others withdrew entirely, sensing that the celebrations had exposed more of themselves than intended. The festivities, mysterious as they were, served a purpose the court rarely understood. They allowed the Empress to glimpse their inner currents when their guard was lowered. And in that liminal space between celebration and control, the path was forged for the shaping of the next generation of her dynasty, beginning with those born to inherit the legacy of shadow and loyalty. If the forbidden festivities exposed the court's desires and fears, the shaping of the Empress's heirs ensured that her legacy would never fracture under competing ambitions. Unlike many dynasties where children were sheltered from the complexities of rule, the Blood Empress believed power must be introduced early, before innocence hardened into defiance. Thus began the training of the marked lineage, a lineage defined not by blood alone, but by a psychological imprint cultivated from the moment a child first opened their eyes within the palace walls. These young heirs were raised in a separate wing of the fortress, known as the Chambers of Origin. Contrary to what the name suggests, these rooms were not designed to comfort or protect. They were designed to observe. Every gesture of a newborn, every cry, every moment of stillness was carefully documented by attendants trained to interpret infant behavior as signs of future temperament. A child who stared too long at shadows was believed to possess heightened perception. One who startled easily was categorized as reactive, someone who would require greater psychological conditioning to withstand the complexities of power. As the heirs grew into early childhood, their education diverged sharply from that of ordinary nobility. While other royal children learned etiquette and literature, the Empress's daughters were taught to read expressions long before they were taught to read words. They sat in chambers where attendants shifted their emotional states from joy to sorrow to anger within minutes, forcing the children to study subtle changes in posture, breath, and voice. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was preparation, molding them into rulers who could navigate deception with the ease of breath. Yet the Empress understood that perception alone did not build fortitude. And so, beginning around the age of 7, the heirs entered the Hall of Shadows not as observers, but as participants. They were asked to describe symbols that shifted under the changing light, to interpret meaning and patterns, even if no meaning existed. The exercise trained them to create narratives where others saw chaos, a valuable skill for a ruler who would one day manipulate entire factions with carefully placed ambiguity. Failures were not punished, but each misinterpretation was quietly noted, forming a psychological profile that guided their future training. One of the most formidable phases of their upbringing was the Walk of Echoes, a childhood version of the chamber used in the Pact of 3 Nights. Here, the heirs spoke their desires aloud, only to hear them echoed back in fragmented tones. The experience was designed to test how firmly they stood by their intentions once distorted. A child who hesitated was encouraged to explore why doubt had emerged. A child who maintained conviction was guided toward responsibilities that required unwavering resolve. Over time, the heirs learned to trust their voice even when the world around them distorted it. But perhaps the most striking element of their training was the presence of the shadow circle. These women did not treat the heirs as children, but as future rulers whose emotional landscape needed to be shaped with precision. They challenged the daughters to detect lies in harmless stories, to sense tension in rooms where no conflict existed, to navigate power dynamics among other children planted within their lessons. By the time these young heirs reached adolescence, they understood court politics with a fluency that rivaled seasoned ministers. Yet this training came with a cost. Many heirs developed an acute sense of isolation, aware that every relationship within the palace carried weight. They formed attachments cautiously, always questioning motives, always measuring the emotional temperature of a room before speaking. The Empress saw this not as a flaw, but as a necessary burden of leadership, believing that rulers shaped by vulnerability and observation wielded power with more precision than those shaped by privilege. And while these heirs matured under the Empress's watchful guidance, the final tradition of her dynasty awaited them, one that would bind their identity to the legacy of shadow, fear, and loyalty that had defined the court since the Empress first claimed the throne. As the heirs grew into their roles, absorbing every lesson carved into the palace walls, the dynasty neared the moment when tradition and destiny converged. This convergence took form in a ritual whispered across generations, yet almost never described in full, a final ceremony known as the Veil of Continuance. It was performed only once in each ruler's lifetime, usually in the quiet years when the court believed stability had settled in. And that, of course, was deliberate. The ritual was not meant for times of turmoil, but for the silent thresholds where the future was still malleable. The Veil of Continuance began at dusk, when the palace corridors darkened into long rivers of shadow. The ruler and the chosen heir walked alone through the Hall of Shadows, their footsteps sending faint patterns of dust drifting into the beams of angled light. Unlike the training sessions of childhood, the symbols now revealed themselves with startling clarity, as if they had always been waiting for this moment. The heir was instructed to interpret the shifting patterns, not as lessons, but as warnings. Some saw serpents curling through one another, signaling the danger inherent in merging ambition with compassion. Others saw fractured crowns, a reminder that power never stayed whole for long. The Empress listened in complete silence, her gaze fixed not on the patterns, but on the heir's voice. What mattered was not accuracy, but instinct. From there, the ceremony continued into the Chamber of Echoes, where the heir confronted the sound of their own uncertainty. The echoes no longer fractured randomly. They shaped themselves around the heir's tone, mirroring insecurities that adulthood had sharpened rather than erased. Many heirs later claimed that the echoes felt alive, as if the chamber itself were testing the mettle of their will. The ruler offered no comfort, no guidance. The unspoken truth was clear. Power required self-navigation, and doubt left unresolved would ease the path for rivals. But the heart of the ritual lay deeper, in a hidden courtyard accessible only through a passage sealed with inscriptions older than the dynasty itself. Here, under the cold clarity of moonlight, ruler and heir stood before a basin filled with a dark, viscous pigment derived from minerals gathered in the earliest years of the empire. Each dipped a hand into the pigment, then pressed their palms onto a slab of stone shaped like a fractured circle. The pigment did not symbolize blood, though many assumed it did. Instead, it represented continuity, the merging of legacy with future intention. When the prints dried, they formed a pattern unique to each succession, a visual code storing the emotional imprint of ruler and heir at the moment of transition. This imprint became the final layer of the dynasty, a message meant not for the present court, but for those who would inherit a world shaped by fear, intelligence, and psychological mastery. Scholars who later examined fragments of these slabs believed they encoded more than lineage. They captured hesitation, ambition, grief, and determination, emotions pressed into stone with a precision modern analysis still cannot replicate. It was as if the dynasty sought to preserve not its stories, but its inner logic, offering future generations a map for rulership built on reflection rather than domination. Once the ritual ended, ruler and heir returned to the palace without announcement. No proclamation marked the shift of power. No ceremony displayed authority. The court sensed the change through subtler cues: the heir's steadier posture, the empress's softer silence, the faint impression that something ancient had been honored once more. And although centuries passed before outsiders uncovered fragments of this legacy, the dynasty endured through those who understood its core truth. Power was not sustained through spectacle, but through the unseen architecture of the mind. If you reached this point, you already understand how rare it is to trace such hidden layers of influence and tradition. If this journey resonated with you, consider subscribing so you can stay connected as we explore more forgotten histories. Leave a like to support the work that brings these stories back to life, and share a comment using the phrase "I walked through the shadows" to let me know you stayed with this tale until the end. And if you're ready to continue down these corridors of the past, there's another video waiting beside this one that deepens everything we uncovered here. So step through and continue the journey with me.